right, good morning. So this morning, or I guess this week, or whatever we want to consider this time, we're continuing our conversation about, we kind of started this last week, but this idea of how does our culture, our world define our relationships, and how does God define those relationships? Several times this past week, I ran across several so-called relationship experts on the radio. And at least, I don't know if we would call them experts, but at least they were some talking head that was given a radio show, and so they were giving relationship advice. And I have to say, it's probably one of the worst sets of relationship advice I had heard. And you may be sitting here thinking, well, what was this advice that was so bad? Were they advocating for unlawful sexual relations as those that are listed in Leviticus 18? No. Were they trying to redefine the roles of man and woman? Also no. So what was making this advice so bad? They were doing exactly what the ungodly cultures and nations have been doing since the time of Genesis. They were viewing relationships between man and woman as purely sexual. There is nothing greater than one could do than please his partner sexually. And if there is no pleasure, there is no reason for the relationship. That is it. That is all. You should move on. And that was just the tip of the iceberg that some of these radio stations would put on. Because yes, they still have federal guidelines on what you can say on air on the radio. But I took a step back and thought, well, if this is what's being put on our radio stations, what is being put on our TV stations, our movies, the videos we'll see online, the podcasts we may listen to? And for the most part, they're saying the same thing. The world is attempting to define our relationships, and we often allow their language and their attitudes seep into our churches and our conversations with one another. And again, this week I want us to think about, how does God define our relationships? How is it different? As we look at Ruth 4, we've already kind of touched on the subject of the kinsman redeemer. And there's a lot here. Before we jump in, I probably should... we'll jump in. We'll jump in first, and then I'll explain what I'm jumping into. So I'll go ahead and read Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, if you want to follow along. Now Boaz has gone to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, my friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." And so they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the foreign country of Moab, is selling this parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it. And I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Wait, no, I skipped one. I skipped 2 lines. So no one's besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz says, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also require Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times of Israel concerning the redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And in this manner of attesting in Israel, so when a redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders of his people, "You are a witness this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion, and all that belonged to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers, and at the gate of his native place. You are a witness of this today." Then all of the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthy in Erepath and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give to you by this young woman." All right, so now to the explanation part. I don't know about you guys, but I think it would be easier to visualize it than actually just me trying to explain what's going on. And so with the kinsman redeemer, we see back in Leviticus 25, there's 4 or 5 different lists of how one could redeem, should redeem, or whatever. And it boils down to, let's see, so you have Elimelech and Naomi, and then you have Mahlon and Chilion, and Mahlon is married to Ruth. So a kinsman redeemer would be a cousin, an uncle, a brother. The list goes on. And so if we are to redeem Mahlon's portion, the person who has the rights first is Chilion, because he is the brother. And if Chilion is also out of the picture, well, then it passes to Elimelech. Well, Elimelech's also out of the picture. And so it goes to an uncle. So say Elimelech has a brother, let's call him Steve. Well, we don't know who this other redeemer is. It could be an uncle, it could be Steve's son, Jeff, or whatever. But then somewhere over here, we get Boaz. Boaz is not going to be the first in line, so of course he has to wait for, we're just going to call him Jeff. Jeff has to renounce his right to redeem the property of Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion, because they're all now tied together. And so what we have going on here is what's supposed to happen. Cities, there's a lot going on here, and I'm going to try not to bore you with all of it. Let's back up even more. Cities and city gates were kind of built like this, sort of. And so when they go before the elders, they're all sitting in this kind of gated area here. And this is where, think of your city hall. Your city hall was the first thing everyone had to walk through before getting into the actual city itself. And so what was happening is, let's bring it to the place, the one public place where we have these authorities, these people who can judge what's going on. And we're going to bring it before these elders, and Jeff, you need to, it's your right. Naomi is trying to sell this property to a redeemer. What does selling property to a redeemer look like? That's another discussion in Leviticus 25 that we can just beat over our heads. The idea is people weren't just buying land because they wanted land. The idea is everyone has their house, their field that they have by rights by being a citizen of this town, or being a member of God's chosen people. Because it goes back to the idea coming from Genesis of we are all created in the image of God, and God selected this select people. So what makes Jim better than me? Nothing. We are both people of God. There is nothing that should separate us in our own country. So Jim gets a house and a yard and rights to some property for farming. I get a house and a yard and some rights to some property. But what would happen is often, well, you still have to use money to buy things, right? You still have to use money to buy things like clothes and Maybe I don't want to eat grain for every meal, so I'm going to go out and buy a calf from someone who's raising cattle. Or maybe we know we have to make contributions to the tabernacle and to sacrifices, and so I need to still put money towards that. Well, say Jim falls down on his luck, and he's unable to pay for these. He's now in debt. What a redeemer would do is come through and say, Jim, I'm going to redeem your property. So I'm not going to evict you. I can't evict you. I can't kick you out of your house and tear your house down and build something else there. You still get your house. You still live there. But it is my responsibility to take care of your house. It is my responsibility to also take care of your field. And until you reach the point where you can buy it back from me, because I'm going to exchange you some money so that you can get out of your debt. But now, what you're supposed to, and now in 7 years, if Jim hasn't paid me back, I'm supposed to just give it back because that's what God tells me to do. And so we can go down the whole list of how this is different, because Boaz is redeeming Ruth and Naomi's land and it's falling to him. We'll get there in a minute, because that's kind of that last bit at the end about Perez and Tamar. But what Boaz is doing is, Jeff, you have the right. You are a closer relative to this family that is now dead. They have this property. Naomi clearly has been in economic hardship this whole time. She and Ruth are widows. They don't have a stable job. Sure, they have the house of their family, but this field, they're not doing anything with it. Let redeem it for them so that they can get some money back from it. And maybe if there's an heir to come out of those two women, that heir can then take control of that land. And so you have all of this going on. And Jeff's like, yeah, sure, I'll take the extra portion of land. That sounds great, Boaz. Thank you for reminding me that I can do this. And then Boaz says, yeah, but you also have to take Mahlon's wife, Ruth. Whoa, I cannot take another wife. If I take another wife, I have to then produce an heir so that there's an heir to inherit this land. And if I do that, it's going to get too complicated. The lawyers will be at my door as soon as anything happens, and they're going to bury me in paperwork. There's also, going back to I guess it's 3 or 4 weeks now, that idea of, whoa, I cannot be associated with a Moabite going on here. There's still that stigma or perception that if a Jew marries a Moabite, they are cursed. You are renouncing your blessing by being Jewish. You are now embracing these other people. You have been cursed. So surely there's a part of, as Jeff then will later hear, Boaz says, well, I'll do it. I'm unmarried. It's no problem to me. I will marry Ruth. There has to be something of, Boaz, what are you doing? You're a worthy man. You're a godly man. Why are you taking a Moabite to be your wife? But since Boaz redeems Ruth, he's doing the godly thing. He's doing the thing that would avoid Ruth and Naomi from being outcast even more so. Because it's already bad enough that they're women, and it's already bad enough that they're widows, and it's already bad enough that they're this or that, and well, now we're about to reach the point where they're now in debt. And so you start running down the list of why people might not be so kind to take care of them, and the list seems to be getting longer unless someone steps in, and someone is that redeemer to help their kinsmen. Because in reality, Jeff, or the unnamed redeemer, that's what he's supposed to do. It's expected of you as a Jewish man to care for your family no matter how distant you are from them. If your second cousins, like your uncles on like your roommate's side or whatever, you're supposed to take care of one another regardless of what's happening. And in this time, we see this happen again with Boaz. Boaz is taking that step further. It is my godly duty to take care of Naomi And so much so that I am willing to marry Ruth. Not that I'm sure it's really twisting his arm at this point. He seems to be a single man, and he's being offered a woman to marry. I'm sure it's an easy opportunity to just not have anyone mention, hey, Boaz, why are you still single anymore? It's the crossing off multiple lines on the list at the same time. And so what we have going on is this whole nonsense is being resolved. It's being solved. There's no, what if these widows have to become debtors and they have to basically sell themselves into servitude or to resolve their debts or whatever. And Boaz is saying, I'm not going to let that happen. And then we get to kind of the blessing that these elders give to Boaz. It's kind of interesting because we've kind of touched on these ideas of blessings and cursings throughout this whole study. The Israelites have a list of blessings and cursings that they receive from Moses at the end of Deuteronomy. And then Joshua repeats them when they get to the mountains where they were actually supposed to say these lists of blessings and cursings. And then Joshua also then writes it on stones and puts it on the altars so that there is no confusion of which one's an altar of blessing and which one's an altar of cursing. And again, I've already mentioned there's this idea of if you take a Moabite woman, if you associate with Moabites, you are on this cursed side. You are becoming cursed, especially in the time of Judges. Ruth occurs in the time of the Judges, and Moab goes up to battle against Israel 3 or 4 times. And so it's one of those, how dare you go up and side with our enemy? And now you're marrying one of the enemies, not just some foreigner that you're commanded not to engage with. You are marrying the enemy. But chapter 4 ends with a blessing. And the elders kind of would undo this idea of cursing. No longer will you be cursed because of this relationship. Instead, may Ruth be like Rachel and Leah in building up your house. The story of Jacob and Rachel and Jacob and Leah is always kind of one of the, we'll talk about it this summer as we go through Genesis, but it's one of those stories that for a lot of people it's not a super positive story. There's the idea of Laban. Laban tricked Jacob into serving for 14 years so that he could actually get to the wife he wanted. To us, it seems kind of, why are you wanting them to be like that? Was there not marital problems between Jacob and Leah and Rachel because of this dynamic, because of Laban's deception? Absolutely. Was there not frustration over children being born or not being born because of this? Absolutely. But to the elders in the city of Bethlehem, there is something different going on in that story. They don't see it as a bad story. They see it as a blessing, a great story. Because through Rachel and through Leah, the whole nation of Israel is born. May Ruth be like the matriarch of all of Israel for your house, Boaz. And if we look back and we jump back into those genealogies, who are the descendants of this relationship between Ruth and Boaz? It's David. It's Jesus. We go down the list. She is the matriarch herself. This relationship is blessed just like Rachel and Leah and Jacob's relationship. What great blessing it is that came out of this. That our Savior came from this. They move on. May Boaz be worthy and renowned in Bethlehem. There is that other name of Bethlehem that they list but it's easier just to say Bethlehem instead of saying the full, long, more Hebrew-sounding name. May you be considered worthy and renowned in Bethlehem. I know godliness doesn't really pop up a whole lot in the Old Testament, or at least the word godliness. It's more of a Pauline thing. He says to Timothy, be godly in all that you do. Command the people to be godliness, or not be godliness, be godly, to seek godliness. But I think in this moment, what the elders are pronouncing upon Boaz is, may you be considered not just worthy, but godly. May you be considered of such renown, such worth in the city of Bethlehem, that your godliness goes before you. We already know by the character of Boaz that we've seen throughout the past couple chapters, he is a godly man. He is a blessed man. But may all of Bethlehem know of it, not because of how you treat the servants in your field, not how you do all this other things, which is good. That is things that make you godly, Boaz. But may you be known as godly because of your relationship with Ruth. May your relationship between Ruth and you be the sign of your godliness. And again, what more godly relationship is there than the one that will lead us or really start us down the line towards the Messiah? Because sure, we could argue, well, Abraham's in that line. Yeah, but Abraham had a lot of kids. Well, what about Jacob? Well, Jacob had a lot of kids. Well, what about it's not, Boaz has one kid that we know of. He has one relationship, and it's with Ruth. This binding of two hearts is a sign of godliness because of everything that these two people are coming together and being even better together. May that relationship be renowned and deemed godly in Bethlehem for all of history. Because who comes from it? Again, David, all of the kings of Judah, and Jesus. We could even jump to the relationship of Joseph and Mary. If we squint hard enough, maybe we see the comparison. A man who is by no means of the law expected to take this woman as his wife. Joseph had all of the excuses in the world for not taking Mary as his wife. She was pregnant before they even got married. That's reason enough. Boaz has all the excuses too. Well, Jeff should be the one. I should not be the one to claim her. I should not even attempt to claim her. I should not be the one to put my neck on the line for this. I have all the reasons why not to. But the godliness commands them to do this. To seek out this partnership. And then we get this last kind of weird line. May their house be like the house of Perez because of the offspring that comes from this line. That's kind of weird. Right? Especially because, sure, in Genesis, we get the story of how Perez is conceived and born. And it's a weird story. And it's one, again, we'll talk about a little this summer as we study Genesis. But the main story is Judah has two sons. This is probably another better illustration. Actually, he has three sons? Whatever. So Judah has three sons at first. Son 1, son 2, and son 3. Son 1 marries Tamar. Oh, Tamar starts with a T, not an I. Marries Tamar. And in this pattern, as we've kind of already alluded to with the idea of Redeemer, son 1 dies. And whose responsibility is it now to be married to Tamar? Well, it's son 2, but Judah won't give son 2 to Tamar. But son 2 and son 3 will die. And so Tamar is left without a husband and without an heir. And so Tamar deceives Judah, and they have a baby together. And that baby is Perez. Now, all of the inheritance of son 1 and son 3 should be going to the heir of Tamar. But also, all of the property of Judah should go to his sons, his living sons, which is Perez, right? And so you get into this whole instance where really multiple lines of inheritance are being mixed together and being solidified in one. It's called a Levirate marriage. The same thing is happening here, because all of this is supposed to be passing on to this heir here, right? But there is no heir. Ruth never had a child with Malion. And so Ruth's heir is supposed to inherit a portion, but Boaz also has his own independent inheritance, but he has no heir. And so what's happening here is when they get together and have Obed, all of Boaz's inheritance and all of this becomes Obed's. And so it's kind of a weird way of saying, yeah, your relationship's going to be a little weird. Your inheritance is going to be a little weird. And unlike Jeff or the unnamed Redeemer's concerns with, well, he probably had multiple sons and already was struggling with who's getting who's getting the extra 1% of debt. At least that's what my parents joked about is, well, it's me. I get to have the 1% of debt more than everyone else because, well, they're teachers and they don't make that much. And so they're not leaving some big grand wealth for me and my siblings to share. It's probably more of the car payments and the mortgage and who gets to settle up that check. And I'll get that extra 1% because I'm the oldest of 3. But in this, Obed is uniting 2 inheritances, and that is the kind of the inheritance that will become, or that will lead to kind of this messianic line, as we've already talked about. But that's also not the only thing that's talked about in this section. Very briefly, in chapter 4, it's 4 verses explain the entire wedding or marriage or kind of this whole relationship. It takes 4 sentences to go from not married to married and with a kid. And I think of how we tell our stories here. No one in telling their stories of how they were married or their relationships with one another would only spend 4 verses on the entire time from when you were married to the time you had your first kid. Because there's so much information in there. I wouldn't know, but it's one of those where listening to people, that seems to be their fondest memories. And yet that's not what is recorded. However, these verses give us some time to look back at some of these relationships. I'll go ahead and read them, and then we'll talk about it. I have too much stuff in my hands right now. Starting in verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in all of Israel. He shall be a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Now Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became the nurse. And the woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son who has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed, he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. It's really two verses that explain the entire relationship, because the other two kind of shift to Naomi's point of view. But that brings us to some of these relationships. The first one is Ruth and Naomi. If we think back, Naomi probably wasn't super excited in those first couple chapters of, great, Ruth is joining me. Sure, it's a family, and sure, it's someone, but there's still that probably bitterness. She is bitter about the whole situation, and so she's going to be bitter about this part too. But over time, we've seen that relationship change. It was kind of just this, Naomi was bitter, Ruth was just there along for the ride. It is a mother-in-law to a daughter-in-law relationship. And then it changed. It is a teacher to a student. Ruth, let me teach you what you need to do to live amongst the least of these in the nation of Israel. And then it changed again. It is mother to daughter. Ruth, I'm going to tell you this because I love you like you are my own daughter. These are the things you need to do when you go to Boaz. And now you see it change again. Naomi is no longer bitter. She is overflowing with joy because she has a redeemer. What Ruth has provided for her 7 sons could not have provided for Naomi. This amount of joy could not be greater. And so this relationship it's kind of still mother and daughter, but it is an even deeper bond of mother and daughter. I'm sure Naomi got to move in with Ruth and Boaz pretty shortly after, because, well, we're not going to let her live in her house because, well, it's kind of run down. We haven't been able to put time and effort into making it nice. So Naomi's going to live with us for a while until we can fix up that house. And that kind of lends us to the relationship between Ruth and Boaz. Our modern world does not see this as a traditional love story. Nothing Ruth and Boaz's relationship says, yeah, that's totally normal for some guy to do to some girl that he finds attractive. But it is a story of 2 independent, godly individuals becoming man and wife. But as the author of chapter 4, or the author of probably the whole book, he didn't just write chapter 4, is writing, it's not just man and wife, it is that they're mother and father now. I think, and this could go off into a tangent that I may want to dig myself out of, depending on how long I go into it. So much of our Bible focuses on this relationship between man and woman. And I think we've become comfortable with saying, yes, it is between man and woman. But we forget what it's building towards. It is not so that they're man and wife and that's all they are. No, they're man and wife so that they are mother and father. It is so that there is a relationship there that brings forth generations. And those generations bring forth more generations. And so that the houses of the families of God are full with godly individuals teaching godly children. I don't think I went too far, and I don't need to dig myself out yet. So I think you could probably just leave it there. The third one is God and his relationship with these 3, or vice versa, however you want to put it. Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz all have unique relationships with God. Ruth is one of those weird books in the Old Testament where God doesn't have a speaking part. He doesn't even really have a super active, upfront, God did this. We think of, well, let's look in Joshua. Joshua, God is very much, he's speaking to Joshua. And if nothing else, God is the one who held up the waters of the Jordan. God is the one who destroyed Jericho. God is the one who kept the sun still in the sky. And Ruth, God's talked about. The relationship with God is kind of hinted at, but God's not up there. He's not a visible character in the story. Well, he's not a visible character in most stories. He's kind of invisible. But what we see, though, is this relationship between these three matures and grows, changes. Ruth goes from a foreigner who is raised with foreign gods, who comes to marry some Israelite who's now living in Moab, and has some who's probably taught just by being in their house something about this God that they serve. And she goes from that, and then when her husband dies, and her brother-in-law dies, and her father-in-law dies, and they're sitting there, and there's the question of what is going to happen now, and they're faced with, well, Naomi's going back to Bethlehem, and you guys should probably go home. Go home to your mothers. There's something about that instance where Ruth says, no, I want to follow God. There's something about Naomi that's going to lead me towards God. She goes from just kind of being someone who's wanting to know more, learn more, experience more. And then it grows again. Now she is not just someone who's kind of knows God. She's learning the steps. She's living clearly different because of the people she's around, and it continues to grow. She will eventually be mature enough to be a godly woman and a servant of the Lord. Most notably, Naomi's relationship with God changes. She is so upset with God that she is willing to change her name to bitterness. God, I am so angry. I'm so bitter. I am so angry with you. Why would you let this happen? So that at the end, I am so filled with joy because of what God has done for me that I'm going to change my grandson's name to reflect my joy. He's going to have the name of Naomi's blessing because I've been blessed so far. Boaz's relationship with God doesn't quite change in the same way. It doesn't have a huge shift where it goes from knowing nothing to knowing so much that they are willing to follow and be a godly follower of God. It doesn't change from I am so bitter to I am so flowing with joy. But it does grow. It does change. It takes small steps. Boaz starts from having a godly relationship with God and ends with a godly relationship with God. But where he is not the same. Where he is when we first meet him is not the same place we leave him in chapter 4. We don't have huge signs. It's not like he was only giving a little and then was giving more. No, but we do see how Boaz is following God takes a lot of faith and trust in him. At times, Boaz probably had the off-ramp that all these other godly men had. Boaz is surely not the only godly man in all of Israel. We see even in the study of Elijah thinks he's the only godly man left, and God says, no, I have kept 7,000 people who have not bent the knee to Ahab. And in this time, I can't help but think, Boaz doesn't cry out to God saying, I'm the only one left. So surely there's someone else, at least in Bethlehem, that he would consider godly. And even then, if Elijah thought he was one and there were 7,000, would there not also be 1 to 7,000 in the time of Boaz? Surely there's other godly men. And surely there's other godly men who had similar instances put before them. But through Boaz's faith, we see him grow and be led. Sometimes our relationship with God changes by how far we're willing to be led. Chapter 4, as I mentioned in chapter 1, chapter 4 ends with the genealogy of David. As I mentioned then, and I'll mention it again, this ending, chapter 4, is a slap to the face to all of those who would have overreacted to chapter 1. Chapter 1, surely someone's sitting there overreacting, saying, what is this story even about? Why are we even writing this story down? And chapter 2 and chapter 3, they're like, oh, okay, whatever. They're sure, okay, Boaz is a great example of being a follower of God. Great. Why do we need this specific story written down? Sure, chapter 3, well, that's kind of a weird story at times. Why is this being written down? And to chapter 4 is that slap in the face. Why are we writing this down? It's because of this. Because of this line, we have David. Because of this line, we have Solomon. We have Rehoboam. We have all, I'm not going to list them all because I kind of just got to the ones I knew. But we go down the line, even to a New Testament audience. You have the Pharisees and Sadducees are most notable in that they picked and chose portions of the Old Testament as these are the most important books. Sadducees would say if it's not written in the first 4 books, it's not worth being written down. Only the Torah is what we need to guide ourselves. The Pharisees added the books of history and some of the wisdom literature. Which then makes you wonder, or at least it kind of makes sense of, well, why didn't they know these prophecies? Well, they just didn't study them. It's like walking up to me and saying, well, how do you not know calculus? Well, I took 1 semester of pre-cal and that was good enough for me. I didn't need more than that. So why don't I know calculus? Well, I just never studied it. What? Pharisees, Sadducees, how do you not know these prophecies that were made about Christ? They never studied it. But it's interesting because if we look in the gospel, the story of Ruth would be extremely convicting to a Sadducee. You hold the Torah so strongly. And where are all these blessings and cursings that we've talked about coming from? It's coming from Leviticus. It's coming from Numbers. It's coming from Deuteronomy. All of these books are saying, starting in chapter 1, this is a story about a cursing. Surely it is about cursing. But even a Sadducee would know his history well enough to say, the Messiah is going to be like King David. It's going to be of the line of David. I may not study the books of the kings or the chronicles of the histories of the kings of Judah and Israel, but they would have known that enough. This book ends convicting those who would hold the law over the power of God. The law was given to kind of set up guide rails. God is not bound to only following the law. If God wanted to say everything that he gave to Moses, both sides, if you follow it, if you don't follow it, are good, like that, God could. Do I think God will? No, because there are some things that are in there that are clearly good for us to have, like don't murder one another, don't steal things, don't steal your neighbor's wife, don't do those things, don't. Like God's not going to say, yeah, it's okay for you to suddenly steal your neighbor's wife and kill him and do all of this. But it is one of those lessons of God is not kept in those guide rails. God is so much more. If God wants to bring a blessing out of something that you say is cursing, so be it. In the story of Joseph, Joseph says something similar. It is, what you have intended for evil, God intended for good. Well, that's what has happened here in Ruth. To someone who is taking the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy legalistically and says, what has happened here is evil in chapter 1. God is saying, no, it is not. I have done this for the good of my people. Not only so that they may have a good king in David, but so that they may have a Savior in Jesus Christ. The bell should have rung by now. But since it hasn't rung, I'll let you guys out early. Thank you guys. We will be in, there it is. We will be in the, I don't know how to explain it other than the boring part of Joshua next week. So we will be trying to get through Joshua 12 through like 22. Don't worry, it's not going to be that long of a class because half of it is describing a map and words instead of just looking at a map. And so we'll be spending some time talking about geography and lines and cities and all that. So thank you guys.